Well, friends, not too long ago, I was walking through my neighborhood in D.C. when I came across some street art, some graffiti, spray painted on the side of an alley wall. It was just one sentence of white text on a black background, and the text read, "It is in your self-interest to be very tender." It is in your self-interest to be very tender. And the sentence kind of caught me up short. You know, it's not often you see graffiti on the streets of D.C. promoting virtues like tenderness, right? I found myself moved and intrigued that someone would speak up for tenderness on D.C.'s tough streets, that someone would come to the defense of tenderness in the capital of a nation whose culture is so often violently polarized. And what really puzzled me about the idea was this idea that tenderness could somehow be in our self-interest. Given the times we live in, that sentiment seemed a little naive, perhaps. Did the author mean it in some kind of karmic sense, as in, if you're tender to the world will be tender back to you? The more I puzzled over it, the more the phrase felt like some kind of Buddhist koan, a riddle that reveals more and more layers of meaning the longer you ponder it. I'd be curious how that phrase strikes you. How is it in your self-interest to be tender? Now, one circumstance in which tenderness can certainly be in our self-interest is when we choose to be tender with our own imperfect selves. When we are kind and gentle with ourselves. That's what my sermon's about today. It's about how we might suffer a little less by showing ourselves a little more tenderness. Because let's face it, we are often our own worst critics. Just last month, I led a day-long spiritual retreat at a church not too far from here. I was teaching folks a spiritual discipline practiced by our Unitarian ancestors called meditative self-examination. It's a practice done at night before bed, where you basically take yourself on a guided meditation of your day, asking questions like, well, where was the sacred present in my day? What am I most grateful for? And even, who or what do I need to forgive? After I'd led the group through the practice, a young man raised his hand and he said, "Rob, that was really hard for me, because whenever I look back on my life, I'm always judging myself. I'm critical of the choices I've made and filled with regret for the things I've done or haven't done." And I hear this a lot from people when I teach practices like meditation or mindfulness. So many of us struggle mightily with our inner critic, with this voice in our heads that can be so judging and self-punishing. You know, the Buddha has a little teaching about this, a kind of parable that he shared with his friends and disciples. He said, imagine that you're walking in the woods, and out of nowhere, an archer strikes you with an arrow. Would it hurt? He asked his students. Of course, they said. And now imagine that soon after being struck by that arrow, you were struck by yet another one. Would that not hurt even more? Well, yes, said the students. The Buddha went on to explain that the first arrow in the story represents the pain and suffering that life sends our way, right? This arrow can't be avoided. We all face painful and difficult situations in our lives. But that second arrow, that's the suffering we inflict upon ourselves with how we react to the pain and misfortune and the stories that we tell ourselves about it. The Buddha called this self-inflicted wound the second arrow of suffering. And this suffering, this is something that we can avoid or at least minimize if we were only a little more compassionate with ourselves, a little more tender. Let me give you just an example from my own life, and as I do, you might think of an example from your own. So 2 years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, I was riding my bike in downtown DC, and I almost got hit by a taxi cab. But in my effort to avoid colliding with the cab, I braked suddenly and went flying over my handlebars and landed on the road and broke both of my arms just below the elbow. Not fun. Now, in the Buddha's parable, this accident is the first arrow of suffering, right? The pain and misfortune, sometimes large, sometimes small, that life sends our way. But it wasn't long before other arrows started raining down on me. One of them was self-blame. I blamed myself for the accident. I said, well, I should have been more careful. I shouldn't have braked so quickly. Why was I biking in downtown DC anyways? Right? This punishing blame tape played over and over again in my head, compounding my suffering. This is the second arrow of suffering. But if you're like me, it doesn't stop there. I had another arrow in my quiver, right? And that was called self-pity. Woe is me, I thought. Here I am in the middle of a pandemic trying to lead a large church, trying to keep my son focused on his online learning, trying to cook and make meals for my family. And now I break my arms in the middle of a pandemic? Both of them? Really? Why do things like this always happen to me? Yeah. Oh, the stories we tell about our pain and suffering. The net result, of course, is that not only did I experience the pain of those broken arms, but I was just punishing myself with all this negative self-talk. This is where a little bit of tenderness toward myself, toward ourselves, could have gone a long way to reduce my suffering, our suffering. So how do we minimize the self-inflicted wounds caused by the second or even third arrows of suffering? How do we do that? Well, first we have to just notice that we're flinging these arrows in the first place. And that's not always easy. When we're in real pain, our suffering can feel like a great big, overwhelming monolith. It can be hard sometimes to break down our suffering into its component parts, to differentiate among the multiple vectors of our suffering. When I broke my arms, I just became really depressed. And that depression was like living inside a dark bank of fog. It was hard to see anything clearly. And at first, this seemed like a reasonable response to breaking both my arms. But pretty soon, the arms started to feel better, and the depression lingered. And that's when I finally took a moment to just step back a little bit and create a little distance between me and my emotions, and to notice that my suffering wasn't coming from the arms, but from those punishing stories I was telling. And I've found that here it's helpful not only to notice the stories that we're telling ourselves, these second arrows that we've flung, but to actually go ahead and name them for ourselves. Give them a name. Naming our emotions can help us get some distance from them, can help us to externalize them a little bit so we can hold them up before ourselves and examine them. Ah, look, this arrow is self-pity. Or, oh, self-blame. I see you. I see you. One of the helpful things about noticing and naming our feelings is that we sometimes see patterns emerge. We discover that there are arrows in our quiver that we go back to time and time again. Oh, self-pity, I know you. You're really familiar to me. You know? Noticing these patterns can give us incredible insight into the habitual ways in which we react to misfortune and the stories we tell about it. I wonder if we can name some of the second arrows that are in our quivers. What are your familiar ways of responding to pain and misfortune? What are the stories you tell yourselves again and again? And are they helpful? Or do they compound your suffering? Now, at this point in the process, at this point of discovering and naming the harm that we sometimes inflict on ourselves, it's really easy to unintentionally launch yet another arrow by beating ourselves up for the second and the third arrow, right? By chastising ourselves for having added to our own suffering. Rob, you wouldn't be depressed if you hadn't wallowed in your self-pity for so long. You can see how, if we're not careful, the arrows just keep coming and coming. That's why at some point we need to declare a truce with ourselves and lay down our slings and arrows. We need to make peace with ourselves, be at peace with ourselves. And this is where tenderness comes in. We can interrupt the cycle of suffering by showing ourselves a little compassion, by noticing, but not judging, the stories that we've been telling ourselves. Just noticing them with a kind attention and a compassionate heart. Oh, look how I've been blaming myself for my bike accident. Oh, look how I've been wallowing in my self-pity. Maybe I can just let that go. It's all right. Rather than judge ourselves for these arrows, we can give ourselves a pat on the back for having developed the ability to notice and name them, because these insights will help us minimize our suffering going forward. In fact, what we really want to be able to do is go all the way back to that first arrow, that misfortune that life sent our way, the one we didn't have any control over, and really acknowledge the pain that we suffered and be compassionate with ourselves. To say to ourselves, Rob, it really was hard to break both your arms in the first 2 weeks of the pandemic. I'm sorry that happened. That's the kind of understanding and compassion that we'd offer a good friend, right? Maybe we could extend that same compassion, that same tenderness to ourselves. I wonder if some of us aren't holding pain and suffering in our bodies that we never really gave ourselves permission or space to acknowledge or to grieve. I wonder if we can't hold those painful places in our lives with a gentle and compassionate embrace. It is in your self-interest to be very tender. The truth is, the more tender we are with ourselves, the more tender we can be with others. The more compassionate we are with ourselves, the more compassion we can share with others. And having made peace with ourselves, we are better able to show up as peacemakers in a world very much in need of them. In the Tao Te Ching, the foundational text of Taoism, Lao Tzu writes, and I'll close with these words: if there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. If there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart. May it be so. Amen.